Martin Luther King Jr. by Laurie Kalkoven. Read by Anya Arun Chidambaram. Dear reader, I was 8 years old when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. died. Too young to understand fully what had happened, but old enough to know that our country had lost a great man. And learning more about Martin's life to write this biography, I finally understood just how great he was. Martin's belief in positive change through love and nonviolence made a real difference. When people around him were understandably reacting to racism with anger and violence, Martin held firm to his belief that only peaceful action could change the world. I hope Martin's life will inspire you, as it has inspired me, to always meet hate with love and believe in your dreams to create a better world. Laurie Kalkoven. Today we're going to read Love and Marriage on page 30. Love and Marriage. Even though Martin had moved even farther north, he still found racism in Boston. Fortunately, he found Coretta there too. I went into place after place where there were signs that rooms were for rent. Martin later remembered about looking for a home in Boston. They were for rent until they found out I was a Negro, and suddenly they had just been rented. Martin eventually found a place to live and focused on his studies. He continued to think about how he could do the most good in the world. He had come to believe that nonviolent resistance was the strongest weapon available in the search for civil rights. But Martin did more than study in Boston. He began to think about finding a wife. A friend gave Martin the phone number of Coretta Scott, a student at Boston's New England Conservatory of Music. Coretta wanted to be a singer and to teach music. Like Martin, Coretta was from the South, in her case, Alabama. Martin called Coretta and asked her to have lunch with him. At lunch, they talked about everything from Southern soul food and music to segregation and racial injustice in the South. From their very first meeting, Martin could tell that Coretta was just as dedicated as he was to the idea of change. After an hour, my mind was made up, Martin remembered later. Before lunch was over, he said, "We ought to get married someday." Daddy King had always wanted Martin to come back to Atlanta, become co-pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, and married an Atlanta girl. He tried to discourage the romance, but the more time Martin spent with Coretta, the more sure that he was that he wanted to marry her. On June 18, 1953, the young couple was married in the front yard of Coretta's family home in Alabama by Daddy King. No hotels in the area would rent a room to black people, so the couple spent their honeymoon night in the guest room of family friends. Those friends just happened to live in a funeral parlor. Martin and Coretta spent the rest of the summer in Atlanta and then drove back to Boston to finish their studies. To love, honor, and obey. At the time Coretta married Martin, most brides promised to love, honor, and obey their husbands. Grooms were not expected to promise to obey their wives. Coretta said that she would not promise to obey. Daddy King was shocked, but he agreed to leave the word out of their wedding vows. Martin and Coretta smiled on their wedding day in 1953. Martin had a number of choices as to where he would work when he graduated. 3 colleges offered him positions. 2 churches in the North wanted him to become their minister. Daddy King hoped that Martin and Coretta would come home to Atlanta. Then a church in Montgomery, Alabama, the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, invited Martin to come down south and preach. In January 1954, Martin drove from Boston to Montgomery to visit the church. Martin knew that if the church members liked his sermon, he would be asked to become their permanent minister. His sermons were always very powerful. They made people think, and they made people want to change the world for the better. The sermon he delivered as a guest preacher that Sunday was no different, and of course, he was offered the job. Martin and Coretta knew in the North things would be easier for them. Going back down south meant living under Jim Crow laws again. It meant having to ride in the back of the bus again. It meant being called names like boy. But the South was also their home. Martin and Coretta decided to go where they thought they could do the most good. So they made the hard decision to move to Montgomery. On September 1st, 1954, they moved into their new home. They found themselves settling into new jobs, a new house, and a new city at all the same time. And soon they would also find themselves in the middle of a movement to change the world. Montgomery. Montgomery, Alabama was the first capital of the Confederate States, the southern states that left the Union during the Civil War. It was believed to be one of the most racist cities in the South at the time. Montgomery. Happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day!